At the end of my sophomore year in the summer, that I got a call from Alan Kumamoto, and Alan said, I have this guy here in my office who's going to start Yale in the fall. He's going to be a graduate student in social psychology. And would you come over and sort of answer some questions, and kind of tell him how things are at Yale. And that's when I met Glenn Omatsu for the very first time. And, Glenn asked me, at our meeting, he said, what are some things that you do? And if you've ever had Glenn as a student, I may be a person of few words, but Glenn can be a person of few words too, and can really be asking a very, very tricky question there. And I remember telling Glenn that, I was involved with, this Chicano student organization called MECHA, and we're, doing all these things with admissions. We're trying to set up the first class. We have conference and all this stuff. And then Glenn asked this question. He said, are the Asian Americans organized at Yale? And I remember thinking a little bit about that question, and I remember my response, and I said, well, that's an interesting idea. And so I said, well, why don't we do something? And so when we went, back, and this is the fall of 1969, and Yale suddenly had its first group of women, and we called together a meeting of Asian American students, and that's how the Asian American Student Association at Yale started in the fall of 1969. And we followed the same agenda, leadership agenda, that the Chicano students, had set. We went to the admissions office. We tried to set up the first Asian American Studies class. And obviously, we had all learned from one another. But that's how I became an Asian American. And like I said, that's how, in a sense, my activism started. And so I owe a lot, to Glenn Omatsu, and he was very, very much the mentor. And Alan Kumamoto, for whatever reasons, deciding to bring the two of us together is how I got involved with Asian American student activities. The other secret that I thought I would tell you, and I'm really saddened that Dale Minami, who was here earlier and who had come at 5 o'clock, could not be with us. And it's a story that I have only told publicly once. I've said it in a few times in interviews. But for the most part, it has been a secret for 21 years. And like I said, I probably shouldn't go into retirement, let alone the grave, with this particular secret. But, I wish Dale were here, because I think it really speaks to his abilities as an attorney, as an activist, and so forth. And this particular episode happens at the end of my struggle, my 3-year struggle to get tenure at UCLA. And to give you some context for those of you who were not involved in that case, and I have to really thank so many of you who were involved, because it really involved, in the end, thousands of people. And but to give you some context, this was after 3 years, after I had won a couple of grievances with an academic senate committee called Privilege and Tenure, that there are newspaper stories in the Los Angeles Times, the local ethnic newspapers. There were student rallies for my tenure. There were various meetings by donors, major Asian American donors and community leaders with the chancellor and so forth. There's petition drives, there were letter writing campaigns and so forth. And after a while I realized that this really wasn't about me. You know, it was something much, much larger. And Dale, in sort of telling a number of people who were supporters, said that you know, my tenure fight was not going to be won on legal you know, sort of grounds. That if anything, if this case ever went to court, like the vast majority of tenure cases, I would lose. Okay, so this really had to be a political fight, and so there's just enormous publicity and mobilization and so forth that took place around this case. And in late April, May of 1989, the case came back to Chancellor Young, and this is maybe the fourth or fifth time that the case came back to Chancellor Young, and he had that opportunity to end the case, to grant me tenure during the 3 years, but he chose to put it back into the academic review process and so forth. And but the case came back to Chuck Young, and this looked like this was going to be, you know, the sort of final, the end of the process. And that was a signal to people in Sacramento who had you know, signed various petitions, had made numerous phone calls to the chancellor and so forth over the years, to suddenly do something. And they had this one committee had this opportunity, and they were presented with a funding bill. And I forget if it were $6 million or $60 million, but it was to build the Anderson School of Management. And they decided to hold it up. And so the Chancellor's office caught wind of this. And they gave me a call and said that Chancellor Young was going to be up in San Francisco for a Board of Regents meeting, and if it were possible for the Chancellor to meet with me and my attorney, namely Dale. So we said that that's fine, and we made arrangements for me to fly up there and for us to meet with the Chancellor. And I remember you know, having lunch with Dale, and you know, Dale asked me, well, what kind of guy is Chuck Young, you know? And I said, well, you know, he's a pretty big guy. I don't know if you, you know, ever saw Chuck, but yeah, he's about 6'3", 6'4", you know, very, very hefty kind of guy. And I said, you know, what I've heard is that he's been known to intimidate people, you know, with his stature and with, you know, he wasn't afraid to bang on a table or whatever. And that's how UCLA had kind of avoided any bad publicity from the LA Times, and well, it also helped that the publisher, or the editor, you know, Franklin Murphy was there too, a former chancellor. But that, you know, Chuck Young was really known for that. And I said, you know, the other thing that I had heard was that because, you know, a chancellor has so many different issues that they've got to deal with, that he's probably only good for about 10 minutes at most in talking about an issue. And so Dale took, those 2 bits of information, in hand, and we went to the, building where the Board of Regents were meeting, had to go through all of these guards and so forth, and we were led to a small little conference room. And we were told that the Chancellor would be with us shortly. And of course they made us wait, for about a half hour. And then the Chancellor comes into into this room. And he shakes our hands and so forth. Big guy, right? And so he begins, and he says, well, before we get started, I'd like to get a few things off my chest. And he said, in the 25 years that I've been Chancellor of UCLA, I have never experienced anything like this. I have never had people calling me a racist. I have never had people calling me at all hours demanding tenure. I've never been the subject of so many protests and letter writing campaigns and so forth. And I remember Dale kind of gently pushing him back. And he would say, well, you know that Professor Nakanishi has nothing to do with this. And that would kind of startle the Chancellor. And he would sort of pull back and say, oh, well, of course, I'm not accusing Professor Nakanishi of anything. or you. And so he went on like this. And he was talking about just, all of these unusual things that had happened to my case that just embarrassed him, that really called into question his character, and so forth. And he did this for about 10 minutes. And he ended, and he said, well, I'm very sorry, I just had to get this off my chest. And, so he said, why don't we get started? And, I don't know, maybe I've been in academics too long, and I sort of treated this like a little seminar or whatever, or, maybe it's my personality or whatever. But, when he said, well, let's get started, I sort of said, okay, let's get started, under my breath. But Dale interrupts, and he says, well, I got something I want to get off my chest. And I went, oh my God. What's happening here? So then Dale starts, and he says, I've been a civil rights attorney for 25 years, and I've never experienced anything like this either. And, Dale then talks, about, how, and I think, he's speaking to basically, a California native, which is what Chuck Young was, and, somebody who really doesn't know very much about Asian Americans, but has certain stereotypes about, our politics, our standing in society, and so forth. And so, Dale says, well, you have to remember, that Asian Americans are just getting involved in politics. So, some of the things that are going on, may seem unusual, but that's because, the community really doesn't have a whole lot of experience doing these things. And you also have to remember that Professor Nakanishi is a Japanese American. Grew up here in Los Angeles. And, you know, a lot of people know him. You know, he went to high school here and so forth, and I'm sure you read his CV, and he was once boy mayor, you know, of Los Angeles. Oh. And, you know, the Japanese American community has just gone through this decades-long struggle. You know, something that Professor Nakanishi wrote about in that award-winning essay. And it just gotten redress, you know? And for all of these, you know, for Japanese Americans to finally get an apology from the government and to also get a little financial compensation. And when they see what you're doing to Professor Nakanishi, you know, this whole case has been reported for the last 3 years. And this case keeps coming back to you. It's come back to you 3 or 4 times. And what do? You know, you have this opportunity. You know, he's one of these grievances. I mean, the dean of his school can't even participate in this review anymore. You know, the chair of his department's been reprimanded. You know, you have all these professors coming forward talking about discrimination, and you don't do anything about it. And so they see one of their best and brightest, you know, being discriminated against. And boy, Dale just kept going on and on. And so in the end, you know, Dale says, well, I'm sorry, you know, I had to get that off my chest too. And then the chancellor, first thing he says is, you know, in this world there are all kinds of white people. There are good white people, and there are bad white people. And I consider myself to be one of the good white people. And I was startled. And under my breath, I said, you know, I think I just got tenure. And, you know, the chancellor then says, you know, I grew up here in California. And I remember when the Japanese Americans, you know, some of my very best friends, you know, had to leave our community, you know, I think it was Riverside, to go into the camps. And I thought that was the saddest day, you know, of my life. And, you know, I was one of those who supported redress. And, you know, I'm really sorry, you know, that this is all kind of transpired the way it has. And he says, you know, that, now I don't believe in horse trading, but, you know, but, you know, on the one hand, I sort of have this problem here with the Anderson School of Business funding. And on the other, we sort of have Professor Nakanishi's promotion. Now, like I said, I don't believe in horse trading. But if somehow you can communicate, and I know you guys don't have anything to do with it, but if there is a way in which you can communicate with people in the legislature, then I will communicate with who I think, you know, I need to communicate with here at the university. And let's see where we stand in a week. And so, of course, in a week, he gave me a call, and he gave Dale a call, and he said, do we have a deal? or he didn't quite say it that way. He said, I now understand that the concern I have has been addressed, and I have made sure that the concern you have has been addressed. And that is how I got tenure.